Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. This is part 2 of my discussion with Professor Sabah Alnasseri, who teaches Middle Eastern politics at York University, is Iraqi, and recently edited the book Arab Revolutions and Beyond. We're coming to you from Toronto. Thank you, Sabah, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So, I think what we want to focus on in this segment is the dynamics of revolutionary change in an age of globalism
Right.
and neoliberalism,
Right.
how it will look like revolutions in the past and how it will look like something else. And I know this is something you have examined.
Right. Right. I will start with the end of the Cold War and the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And because this world historical context is very important in understanding any kind of politics, revolutionary or otherwise. Since the 90s, we observed the dominant political form in Europe, the United States, but also the other parts of the world is populism. Before, at least until the 70s, political parties were organized around specific classes, articulate interests of classes, the social democracy for the working class, etc. But since the 90s, the dominant political form of the ruling classes is populism. And that's not a coincidence with this neoliberal offensive, with half of the world open to be conquered by neoliberalism after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. There's a radical shift in the form of politics, articulation of interest, representation, etc. So what we see is that the majority of the population in a worldwide scale actually are excluded from the political system, are not represented. Their interests are not articulated. So I believe that within this context, and that's why the current revolutions are different than the historical one, that revolutions and revolt probably is the only political form available for the popular classes to introduce a radical change in the constellation.
Well, I agree completely, and that is the thesis of my own book, Wages of Rebellion. But what about nationalism? I mean, nationalism still remains a powerful force.
Yes, yes and no, because nationalism now is embedded in an international or global context. So even nationalist movement, if they are not linked to a wider movement and solidarity and support, their prospective of success is almost zero. You can see this, take the example of Syriza in Greece.
Right.
Syriza, the first right approach was to say that you need a Europe-wide movement and solidarity in order to empower Syriza in Greece to deal with the European Central Bank, with the IMF, etc., and the EU Commission, etc. So there's a sense of embedding nationalists, or national, let's say, movement within a wider context, a regional or international context. I think this is very important. It's different than the old form of internationalism in 3 instances. The first one, it was mostly European-centered, not international in this sense. The second point is it was mostly class-based. And third, all these revolt and revolution were organized by a political party with a strong leadership.
But that wasn't true for the Communist Party. There was an internationalist element to that.
Yeah, but again, if you look at it historically, we'll see mostly within Europe. There are some connection to other parts of the world, but mostly it was within Europe. And I think that's a big difference today. We have, you can call it the first international of the people. It is cross-class, it's not nation or nation-state centered, and it's not articulated, organized by a specific political party.
But wouldn't it be fair to say, let's look at the Arab world.
Right.
Wouldn't it be correct to say that within Arab resistance movements, there's actually quite an antagonistic split between nationalists and, let's call them, internationalists?
Yes.
And you see that with the split within jihadist movements.
Yes.
And let's take Al-Qaeda, for instance.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda was a movement that had no loyalty to any particular nation
Correct.
state, which is why they condemned Hamas as apostates.
Yes.
Because or broke with the Algerian resistance movement, the Jama'a Islamiyya, because they were focused on the liberation of a particular country.
Within Algeria, yes.
And this has been a conflict within, now we have the creation of ISIS, which is forming a new state, a new caliphate, and not, in essence, attempting to play to either Syrian or Iraqi nationalism. But I wonder if that split is still powerful.
Yeah, I mean, we have the juxtaposition of two different times and temporalities here. The first one is when you talk about Hamas or the FIS, the Islamic Front in Algeria, etc. These movements were, formed during the Cold War, during the bipolar world order, and within a specific context, right? Whereas Al-Qaeda or Islamic State and so on is the post-Cold War world context. And again, you have, as I said, the juxtaposition of two different temporalities. Yes, still national and sometimes nationalist movement matter in the struggle, but their prospects of success, as I said, is almost zero if they are not embedded in a wider coalition, a platform of different forces, regionally and internationally.
But there's no common ideology. I mean, what's the ideology?
That's a good point. Not only there's no, centralizing force like a political party and a strong leadership. In the case of the ISIS, yes, there is a strong leadership. But if we look at the wider region, there is no strong political parties and strong leadership to strategically organize and articulate all these interests.
Which is what the Ba'athists who rose out of Nasser's revolution did throughout the Arab world, in Syria and Iraq. And
that is up until the 90s, but then shifted in the 90s. Even the Ba'athists were
well, they discredited themselves. But we don't have, I mean, that secular idiom, part of the reason within the Arab world or the Muslim world that people turn to orthodox religious movements is because of the bankruptcy of these secular, nationalist, liberation movements.
So we have the lack of political form, a popular form, to articulate these demands and so on, needs of the people. And you're right, there's the ideological moment. The crisis of the secular, so-called secular political parties and movement and so on. And there are no other alternative except neoliberalism, privatization, and corruption. It's not only that people turn to religion, but we shouldn't forget too that these religious forces were already active in the region during the Cold War. And mostly, think about it, they were supported by imperialist power. So they were already active. And then in the time of the crisis, political crisis, ideological crisis, they were the only one that can appeal to the people and challenge whatever political system in place. If you look at, for instance, what I have termed 20th century jihadism, it started within the First World War, when Germany, for instance, were using Muslim against France and the UK, and vice versa. So each
let me just throw that in. That was true in Yugoslavia. The Ustasha, the fascist regime, was raising Muslim battalions to fight the Serbs.
Correct. That I was criticizing when I was in Germany, all these, Islamophobia against Muslim, and they don't belong to us. And I was saying, people, the first mosque was built in Germany was during the First World War, and it was done by the German states for prisoners, mostly from North Africa, Arab Muslims who used to serve at the French army. When they were captured as prisoners, they put them in extra camps, separate from other prisoners, and build a mosque for them to use Islam as an anti-French, anti-British political force. During the Second World, after the Second World War, you can see the U.S. utilizing Islam. Muslim Brotherhood is a good case here. Sayyid Qutb, who he was a social democrat until 1948, until he went to the U.S.
We should say that he's sort of the founding father, Egyptian intellectual of, let's call it modern jihadism, very large influence on Osama bin Laden. Right.
Exactly. So he shifted after he came back from the U.S. because he was socialized in a very Orientalist way. And Islam was used, a prominent figure here is Bernard Lewis, very well in the United States. He was arguing in the 50s we should use Islam as an anti-communist force. So you have these forces already operating within these states, but they were not popular compared to the socialists or nationalists and so on. With the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the New Rebel Offensive, this regime were discredited. This ideology were discredited. So the only force in place were these religious forces, right? So they filled this vacuum. Well, ideological, much more important for young people who join this movement is not so much the ideological appeal, because they consider themselves Muslim anyway. But what, as I said, what attracts them is the lack of vision, lack of alternative, lack of the possibilities of having a normal life.
Right.
If you are in Egypt and you are a young person and you want to get married, the expectation is you should have own apartment.
Right.
You will never ever be able to afford an own apartment.
This is true in Gaza, you know, in Palestine as
Absolutely.
well.
So the material
Right.
needs, the basic material needs of people, which are not satisfied. I think that's the core, core issue. You know, Chris, I mean, the function of the, let's say, the ideological function of the construction of the absolute evil is to justify all your evil. Once you design the Islamic State or whatever as the absolute evil, whatever you do, all the means are justified.
Right.
So it fulfills a function, as I said, during this crisis. And I think that's why religion plays a significant role in politics today, and not only as they claim in the Middle East, but you can say in a worldwide scale. And I think this is a phenomena that challenges, you know, lefties on a worldwide scale, and how to deal with it. And the mistake of the left was, for a long time, at least as I know it from the Middle Eastern left, they used to think in this modernist dichotomy of secular religious. Right. Secular is good, religious is bad. Right. They never really paid attention and engaged seriously with religion. And it's kind of crude way of reading Marx, because Marx, when he criticized religion, he doesn't criticize people for being religious, but he criticized the social relation that makes religion so necessary for the people. That's the most productive way engaging with it, without excluding people and demonizing people. And I think that's the way we should engage with it.
Well, definitely. The problem is that if we're going to call them the revolutionary forces,
yes,
within Europe,
yeah,
within the industrialized world,
yeah,
they don't have a utopian ideology,
yes,
that calls for that kind of self-sacrifice,
yes,
or
yeah,
that offers an alternative vision,
yes,
that the jihadist movements in the Muslim world do.
Yes. But again, I mean, what gives me this optimism, as Gramsci would say, optimism of the will, despite the pessimism of the intellect,
right,
is that when you look at the Arab Revolution, for instance, in Tunisia and Egypt and so on, and you look at the counter-protests in Beirut and in Iraq, you can see at a specific point, people overcome all these distinctions, artificial borderlines, and act and argue in a non-religious way. That means they are clearly aware of the limits of what these jihadists or whatever conservative group can offer. And they know that the problem cannot be solved through this form of religious, fundamentalist, whatever organization. We need alternative. So the question is, what kind of alternative? And I think it's kind of trial and error. People have to work their way through and out the crisis to come up with a new organization, new type of parties.
The problem is they've got the guns.
Yes.
We saw that in Egypt.
Yeah.
So the
yes,
secularists,
yes,
courtesy of Morsi,
yeah,
from the Muslim Brotherhood,
right,
who's
right,
now in prison,
right,
and facing the death sentence,
right,
and was overthrown by Sisi,
right,
is that they actually built an alliance with
yeah,
the military in an effort to placate the military, and they used physical force to
correct,
crush the secularists.
correct,
That's
correct,
of course what happened in Iran,
yes,
when Khomeini came back.
Yeah, correct. And I think that's why I'm saying now even nationalists or national movement cannot succeed if it's not organically linked in a wider context. Like, for instance, it's almost impossible for the people in the Middle East, especially the young people, to introduce any radical change without people in the United States or Canada and Europe actually engaging and pushing their government not to intervene in their affairs.
Right. No, it's the occupation and intervention. But the problem is
yes,
that they speak the language we taught them to speak,
yes,
which is violence.
Yes.
And as you have correctly
yes,
pointed out, the Arab Spring,
yeah,
the peaceful protests, which
yes,
lasted a year in Iraq,
yes,
the
yeah,
mass demo, were all nonviolent.
Correct.
And what was the response of essentially proxy states for
right,
the American empire?
right,
Was to gun them down in the streets.
yes,
And when you gun people down in the streets like that, you know, Nietzsche kind of got it.
yes,
You create the monster you get.
Yes.
And that is, for me, the tragedy of what's happened. That the centrifugal force within
yes,
the Arab world was nonviolent,
right,
was secular,
right,
but the forces that we support, whether in Egypt or whether in Iraq,
Absolutely.
pulled out automatic weapons and shot these people down.
Absolutely.
And that's how we got ISIS.
Yeah. But maybe two, as I said, maybe positive moments. The first one from Tunisia, when Ben Ali told his general to shoot at the people, the general responded, "Since when we shoot at our own people?" At that moment, Ben Ali realized he doesn't have any power. He collapsed. The second one was yesterday. I was reading about the protests in Iraq, and it was a beautiful example of how things can shift. One police officer was sent by his commander as an agent provocateur to actually destroy the protests. What he did, he went to the protest and he took his cell phone, and on the public, he mentioned the commander who sent him to be an agent provocateur and destroy the protest, expose himself and his commander in front of the people. This is something new.
Right.
And I think these examples give us some hope that despite the violence and terror and all these conservative fundamentalist setbacks, I think people will overcome these limits and difficulties and come up with a different vision, different maybe perspective for the future. But again, you're right, it will be accompanied by violence, a massive amount of violence. But I think there's no other way out.
Well, inshallah. What they say in Arabic, yom fil mishmish, tomorrow we eat apricots, which means
Correct.
it'll never happen.
Correct. Correct. It will never happen, depending on the time frame we think of. In the short term, you're right. But I don't know what is the impact of the Arab Revolution in the mid and long run. Just like we don't know, actually, what is the impact of the French Revolution in 1789.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So that's why I think we shouldn't, give up hope.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching Days of Revolt.